Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you might be around the world. Welcome to Automation for Jira's first webinar, entitled Automation 101 Tips and Tricks to Get Started. We'll introduce ourselves in 2 seconds. I think it's just ticked past 8 a.m. over here in Sydney. I'm aware that everyone around the world has different time zones, so I'll just sort of run through what we're going to be doing very briefly. It's going to be about 35 minutes or so. I'm not going to be talking for long. Andreas is the real brains of the operation here. So he is the one who's going to walk you through the different components, or what I like to call building blocks from my own sort of special mind, in how to create these rules. We're not going to be doing it through PowerPoint. We're actually going to do it within Automation for Jira to show you how it works that way. And also just to keep in mind that I know there's going to be lots of questions coming through, and we're going to try to answer every single one of those, but we will also leave those to the end, just in case, again, people need to go and do things wherever you might be. So with that in mind, I'm going to go get started now. Right. So let me start with introducing ourselves. So that's myself there on the left. My name is John. I'm the Marketing and Business Development Manager here, which basically is a fancy way of saying I sort of write the blogs, create the webinars. You might also recognize my name from support tickets. I help customers every morning, at least I try. And yeah, this is Andreas to my left, to let him introduce himself.
Yeah, hey everyone. So I'm one of the co-founders here at CodeBarrel. So just a little bit of history about myself. So I guess I worked at Atlassian many years ago. So I was there for almost 9 to 10 years. And it's the same with my co-founder, Nick. He was there over 10 years even. And so we both worked on Jira when we were at Atlassian. Now, you might be wondering where this idea of automation for Jira came from that we're going to introduce today. And that's really something that Nick and I were kind of chatting about a lot when we worked at Atlassian. We were using Jira, obviously, a lot at Atlassian, and we saw lots of opportunities to kind of automate all these little manual processes inside Jira, like the kind of all the repetitive tasks that can be a bit tedious, but even add some more, we also wanted to add some more power to Jira. However, when we were at Atlassian, we were never really able to get these things on a proper roadmap or anything like that. And so about 3 years ago, we both kind of left Atlassian and started CodeBarrel, and that's where we really kind of started working on this idea of automation for Jira. And yeah, we've been quite happy that that's done well, and we've now got an add-on that we can run a webinar and getting started series about. So I'll pass back over to John to introduce the rest, the remainder of automation with Jira before we go back to the demo.
Cool. Just realized we're wearing the same t-shirt as well. It's an awkward choice. Okay, so before we kick onwards, I suppose at the end of this webinar, what I'm hoping is everybody's going to walk away feeling quite confident with the triggers, the conditions, and the actions at the very least. So they're the basic building blocks that you're going to use to create every rule. You should also be inspired to create your own automation rules. So I should probably have started off by saying when I actually joined CodeBarrel and Automation for Jira, I didn't really know what Jira was from a very basic level maybe, and I wasn't very tech-minded. Why they hired me, but there we go. But now I actually create automation rules. It's quite simple, even for someone like me. So hopefully you'll be creating your own rules. Equally, you can just steal some of our rules. I'm going to show you the automation playground in a moment. So everything we covered today, we've already published online in our playground for you, so you can steal it and adapt it for your own needs. And equally, I know there's customers who may have just started using automation for Jira a week ago. There might be some who've been using it for years and are just looking for tips and tricks to improve. And there might be those who've never even heard of automation for Jira at all. So this is a chance for you to improve your existing automation for Jira rules. And I suppose on that note, just in case there is anybody who's watching who has never heard of automation for Jira, shame on you. Essentially what it is a really good tool for automating and extending Jira. And you don't need to use scripts, you don't need to code, you don't need to hack APIs. It's as simple as just using these building blocks that I keep talking about to create these rules. So with that in mind, what I want to do is show you this page, which is our docs playground. So this is especially for anybody watching, you can just watch or you can click around in your own Jira instance, or the third option is you can go to this link, our rule playground in our docs, and it's essentially a safe environment where you can play around with the rules. You can do whatever you want essentially without breaking anything. This goes for the people watching the video later on. I know there's lots of people who, you know, it's 4 a.m. in Morocco, I think one of the customers said, and he's not that keen on getting up for it. So now you can sort of go in as well and just play around in the playground while Andreas walks through the rules. So, oh yeah, there's my clever animation. I forgot to put that in. So that's where you'll find the role playground link. So the last slide, you'll be glad to know. I know people don't really like PowerPoints these days. Before I hand over to Andreas, is just my perspective on automation for Jira. When I came aboard, I was the first sort of non-ex-Atlassian person and a non-tech person. And the way that I helped myself learn what automation for Jira was pretty quickly was using the sort of analogy of Lego blocks or building blocks. So no matter what kind of a rule you're building, the idea is that it's always the same blocks. You just put them together in different ways, like I used to do when I was a kid, really, really badly. So in our case today, the 3 core ones are going to be the triggers, the conditions, and then what's going to execute the rule, the action. So they're the building blocks. We use those and we're going to put them together in different ways. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to the brains of the operation, and Andreas will show you all of these in more detail.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, John. All right, so we're actually going to jump into a live demo now to kind of explore all these concepts that John just introduced in a bit more detail. So first of all, I'm just going to point out again, we have the rule playground. So if you just go to our docs.automation.jira.com, click on the playground at the top, you can actually see quite a few different demo rules in here if you just expand all of them. But then on the left here, we have this webinar 101 label, which includes all of the rules that we'll cover today in our webinar. Okay, so that's enough of that. So let's actually jump into Jira, and we'll sort of, we'll build up these 4 rules one by one, and I'll walk you through all the different components that we have in these. Okay, so we're in a project here in Jira. This is just a standard software Kanban project. We've got a few issues created already, and we'll jump into the project settings now for this project. Now, if you have automation for Jira installed, you get this new project automation admin section down the bottom left here. So just quickly covering what you'll see when you get started. We basically don't have any rules defined yet. So this is as if you've just installed automation for Jira. So in this case, we actually give you a quick little intro call to action here where you can create some sample rules. So these are some of our most common use cases that we've found our customers using. And if you click this button, it will just generate a few disabled rules to get you started. We also then have a bunch of filtering controls. You can look at rules that are in this project, or you can look at rules that apply to all projects. And we'll talk about this concept of global versus project rules a lot more in our more advanced webinar next week. Today, we're going to focus more on building rules and all the components involved in a rule. So we're going to go ahead and jump straight in. So we're going to create our first rule. So for that, we just click that create rule button, and that gets us into our rule editor. So before I begin creating this rule, let's just introduce what we're going to do here. So we have a pretty common use case where if an issue is created in Jira, we want to add some subtasks. So imagine you have a software project and somebody raises a new feature, and you want to automatically create some subtasks to do things like implementing the feature, running some QA tests, and writing docs. So let's create a rule for that very simple scenario. So we're going to start with a really easy use case, and then gradually we'll introduce more components and get slightly more complex throughout this webinar. All right, so first, with a rule, we have to pick a trigger. So this is really what starts the rule execution. And we have a whole bunch of different triggers available. So we have all the different issue events. So you can run an automation rule, for example, when an issue is commented, or when an issue is created, or when it's transitioned through its workflow. And then we also have some more advanced triggers. So things like field value change trigger. So you might want to run a rule, say, if the priority of an issue changes to a different value. And you can even do things on schedule. So you might want to kick off a rule once every day or once a month to search for some issues with jaql. Like maybe you want to look for issues that are overdue and then add a comment to those issues. But for this really simple rule today, we're just going to pick the issue created trigger because we want to add some subtasks as soon as an issue is created. So with this trigger, there's actually no configuration. We can just add this trigger and you'll get a nice little preview of the sidebar, of the rule in the sidebar. And then once I've added this trigger, I get a choice of our next components. So these are the different building blocks that John introduced earlier. Now we're going to have a look at conditions and branches in our next couple of rules. But for this rule, we're just going to pick an action. Now, once again, with actions, we have a whole heap of all the different issue actions available. So you can create issues, you can edit them, you can transition them, you can assign them, and so on. And there's also some more advanced things, like you can send emails, you can send Slack messages, you can even send webhooks to some external service that you might have in your infrastructure. But for today, we're going to look at just creating a bunch of subtasks for this issue that was just created. So now with this action, there's a bit of configuration that we need to fill in. So with this particular action, we need to obviously tell it what subtasks to create. So let's just go and add some summaries for these subtasks. So we obviously want to implement the features of this story that was created. We need to run some QA tests. And then finally, maybe we want to write some docs. And that's really it. So we've configured our action now. We can save this. Now we could add more actions and component or conditions to this rule. So you can have as many as you like in a rule. But in this particular rule, all we want to do is create 3 subtasks when an issue is created. So we can now basically give this a nice little name. And enable this rule. So this rule is now live and should execute when I create an issue. So let's go ahead and actually try it out. So I'm going to jump back to our Kanban board here and create a new issue. We're just going to create a nice little software story here. So we've got a new issue here. And when I reload the board, you can see that the 3 subtasks that we just defined all were created straight away for this issue. And if I jump back to our rule now, there's one other thing here that's quite useful. So that's the rule audit log. So with the audit log, you can see all the things that the rule performed. So in this case, we can see 1 successful execution here for our Web 25 issue. So if I jump back real quick, that's the issue that I created. So that's what triggered the rule. And then on the left here, you can see all the actions and conditions that were performed. So we can see that this rule went ahead and created our 3 subtasks. So those line up with those 3 subtasks that we created over here. So the audit log is a really useful tool for debugging rules. You can see all the errors, you can see why a condition might not match, and so on when rules are executing. So that's really our first rule for today's webinar. So as I mentioned, this is a really simple one, only uses 2 building blocks. But let's jump right back to our rule list and do something a little bit more complex. So for the next rule, we're going to introduce a new building block. So this time we're going to add a condition to our rule as well to limit what issues this rule will execute for. So the particular use case that we're going to look at here is automatically assigning issues. So this is quite a common scenario. So the example we're going to look at is when an issue is transitioned through its workflow to in progress. If it's a high priority issue, then we want to immediately assign it to someone in our team, because we want to make sure that these high priority issues get looked at straight away. So in this case, we need to pick a trigger again. Every rule starts with a trigger. So as I mentioned, we want to run this rule in this case when an issue is transitioned. So we'll pick the issue transition trigger. And this time, this transition trigger actually has a little bit of configuration. We can actually tell it which statuses we want to run the rule in. So in this case, we will run this rule only when an issue is moved to in progress. So let's go ahead and save that. And now we're picking our next component for this, our next building block for this rule. So in this time we're going to pick a condition. Now with conditions, just like with triggers and actions, we have quite a few different choices here. So one of our most popular conditions is the jaql condition. So that allows you to run some jaql to check if the issue from the trigger matches this jaql. But we can also do things like run a user condition. For example, we could check if the reporter of the issue that was transitioned is in a particular user group. And there's even some more advanced things, like you can check conditions with related issues. So to see if all subtasks of an issue match something. And we'll have a look at this in a later example today. For now, we're just going to pick the simple jaql condition, and we're going to match here against priority. So we're going to make sure that only the highest priority issues will match this rule. So that's all we have to do. And then once again, we can continue with either adding more conditions or we can add actions. And so as I mentioned, for this use case, we want to assign the issue if it's a high priority issue that was moved to in progress. So the sidebar over here is always a really nice overview. You can kind of follow through one by one what this rule will do. So as I mentioned, let's pick the assign issue action. Now with assign, you can do quite simple stuff. So you could just assign this issue to a single user, just like you do on an issue. But we've actually added quite a bit more power to this assign action. And so you can actually do things like assign issues to a list of people, to a group of people. So what I've done here is I've configured this assign action to randomly assign this issue to either John or myself. So that's a really quick and powerful way that you can distribute workload across your team. And you can even do this with a balanced workload as well, where our assign action would make sure that both myself and John have the same number of issues assigned to them all the time. But for today, we're just going to go with random. It's a little bit contrived, but it will work for this demo. So that's really it. So we've got our rule now. So just to run through this again, when an issue is moved to in progress, if it matches the highest priority, then we assign it to either John or myself randomly. So once again, we give this a nice little descriptive name and then turn it on. So let's go ahead and try this rule out. So if we jump back to our board here, let's, for example, move this Web 26 issue to in progress. Now, if I jump to that issue, you'll notice here that it's actually not been assigned, even though we moved it to in progress. And that's because this is currently a medium priority issue. So if I jump back to our rule, once again, we can check the audit log. And you can see here already that there's a no action performed execution. And in fact, if we look at this, the rule did execute for Web 26. However, our jaql condition did not match, right? So if I click through to this condition, you can see here that, well, that issue is not the highest priority. So let's go ahead and fix that up and try it again. So let's change this to the highest priority, move the issue back to to-do, and then jump back to in progress. And now if I reload this issue, you can see that it's randomly picked me and assigned the issue to myself. And if I come back to the audit log, once again, we can see that there's now a successful execution for that same issue. This time the jaql condition passed, and the rule was assigned to a random user. So just to recap this rule, we've really just introduced one extra building block, which is conditions, but you can already see that this is adding quite a bit of power to these automation rules. And so for our next rule, we're going to get a little bit more complicated again. We're going to introduce another building block to show you how you can compose these conditions and actions in even more interesting ways to solve even more complex use cases. So for this next rule, we're going to look at a scenario where, say we have a support help desk, and when users raise issues, we track which country they come from. So they fill in a country custom field in their Jira issues. And we want to automatically assign those issues to users that speak the language. So if an issue is raised from Germany, it should assign it to myself because I speak German badly. And if an issue is raised, say, from America, it will get assigned to John because he's obviously very fluent in English. All right, so let's go ahead and create that rule. So once again, we're going to trigger this rule on create. So as soon as a support request or an issue is raised by a customer, we want to run this rule. Next, we're going to add a condition again, and we're going to use one of our special little condition blocks here. So we have this if-else block that allows you to solve slightly more complex use cases with automation for Jira. So this adds a kind of branch execution to your rules. So we can run some code, or we can run some components or actions here if our first conditions are true. And otherwise, we will jump into this else block where some other conditions will run. So let's go ahead and configure this further. So I can add a condition to this first if block with some jaql to check that the country is equal to Germany. And then I will add an action to assign those issues to myself. Next, I can add an else over here, and once again add a condition to this to check if the country is America, for example. And we can add a further action to this branch now to assign those issues to John. So let's just have a quick look again on in the sidebar to see what's happening here. So an issue is created. If the country matches Germany, we assign it to myself. Otherwise, if it matches America, it's assigned to John. Now, one more thing we might want to do here is, if there's a country other than those two up here, we might want to assign it again randomly to John or myself to make sure those issues don't slip through. So we can add like a catch-all kind of condition here without any specific checks that will simply assign it again randomly to either John or myself. So I'll just pick John and myself here again. And you'll see now if none of these up here match, then we'll fall into our else block that will assign it randomly again. So let's give this a name again and try it out. All right, so let's jump back to our board and create an issue. So this is from a German user, obviously. So I'm going to pick the German country here. And then let's create another issue from an English-speaking user from the US. And go ahead and create that issue. And you can see already here on my board that the German issue was immediately assigned to myself. And the American or English issue was assigned to John. And once again, if we come back to the audit log, we'll see two successful executions here that show us exactly what happened. So for the first issue, the first if block passed. And so we assigned that issue to myself. And then for the second execution, for the English issue, the first if block did not match, but the else or if else block here matched, and we assigned that issue to John. So you can see already how all these different building blocks can really be composed in quite complex ways to solve pretty much any use case. So it's really quick and easy, though, to create these rules with our rule builder. All right, let's jump into our last rule now. And this is probably the most complex example we'll cover today. So for this last rule, we're going to cover probably our most popular use case, which is synchronizing related issues. So in this particular use case, we're going to look at synchronizing parent and subtasks issues. And in particular, we want to resolve or move the parent issue to done when all subtask issues are closed off. So this is a really popular thing that people always want in Jira that Jira doesn't do out of the box. So let's create an automation rule for this particular case. So once again, we start with a new rule, pick our trigger. So this time we will run this rule when an issue is transitioned. So we want to kick this off when a subtask is moved to done. And then next we can pick another different type of building block here, which is the branch rule or related issue component. And this lets us do stuff with related issues. So we can choose from any number of related issues here. We can do things with subtasks of parents. We can do things with the parent of a subtask. We can do stuff with stories and an epic. We can even do things with linked issues. We can search for related issues by jaql even. But for today's rule, we're going to do something with the parent. So remember, this is when a subtask is moved to done. We also want to move the parent to done. So now on this branch here for the parent, so these actions will now be performed on the parent issue, not the trigger issue. We can now also transition that. And in fact, we can just move that to done. So this rule like this would kind of work, but it's actually not quite what we want. So right now, this rule would move the parent issue to done if any subtask is moved to done, even if some of the other subtasks are not finished yet. And that's obviously kind of too early. We don't want to close off the parent if there's still some work to be done on our subtasks. So we can add another component here. So you can insert components anywhere in the rule chain very easily. And we can add a related issue condition this time. So this is one that I introduced briefly earlier. with this condition, you can actually assert things on related issues. So in this example, we're asserting something for the parent issue. So we're on the parent issue branch here. And now we're checking if something holds true for all the subtasks. So in this case, we can actually match and to see if all the subtasks match status done. And only if all of them are completed now, then do we want to transition the parent issue to done as well. And that's really it. So it's a pretty complex use case, but it's pretty easy to follow once you look at the overview in our sidebar. So let's go ahead and give this rule a name and enable it. And try it out as well. So if we jump back to our board here, we've actually got one issue here, this web1 issue that has already a bunch of subtasks that are done. So we've got 2 subtasks that are done, but there's still one of these, the schedule webinar subtask that's in to do, and the parent issue is in to do as well. So let's see what happens if I move this last subtask to done. So if I reload the page, you can see straight away that the parent was moved to done as well. And if I jump back to our automation rule, we can see the successful execution here. So we can see that the subtask that triggered this rule was web3. And then we branched off for the parent, which is the web1 issue that we were just on. Our related issue condition over here, that all subtasks now must be done, passed. And so we went ahead and also transitioned the parent to done. All right, so that's really it. So hopefully these rules were quite useful, and we've kind of gone through quite a few different types of components and concepts today. But before we finish with the presentation of the rules, I wanted to show you one last really useful thing with automation. And this is something that we'll cover a lot more in the webinar next week as well, where we'll introduce more advanced concepts. So for this, we're going to come back to the auto-assign high priority rule that we created earlier and add a smart value. So one thing with this rule is right now, if we look at it, all it does is when an issue is transitioned to in progress, if that issue matches the highest priority, then we assign it to a random user. Now, one thing that would be nice with this rule is if we could actually add a comment to that issue as well to let the reporter know, hey, we know this is a high priority issue and we've got it assigned and somebody is going to work on this very soon. So we can just go ahead and edit this rule, add a comment, and tell the user we're working on it. Now, one thing that would be nice here is if I could actually address the reporter of the issue by their first name or by their name. And so what we can do is we can insert this special, what we call smart values with this double curly bracket syntax. So let me just finish typing after the rest of the comments and explain what this does further. So when this rule actually runs, it will replace this little construct up here with the actual issues reporter for the issue that was transitioned when it adds the comment to the issue. And so this is a really powerful way that you can access issue information in your automation rules. So this is something that you can use pretty much anywhere, pretty much in any action or condition in automation for Jira. And you can access pretty much any field information. So say the issue summary, description, custom fields, anything really. And as I mentioned, we'll cover these in a lot more detail next week as well in the more advanced webinar. But let's just try this out real quick. Let me go ahead and actually move our high priority issue back to in progress. So we've got our high priority issue up here. So let's move it back from to do to in progress. And then if I jump back to this issue, you can see down here the comment that is added has actually added John's name to the comment. So it's a really quick and easy way that you can add issue information into your automation rules. All right, so that's pretty much it for the live demo today. So just a quick reminder, all of these rules that I've just demonstrated are available in our rule playground. So you can have a look at them yourself and you can even jump in and try editing them. But before we jump into questions, I'm going to pass back to John just to give myself a little bit of a breather. And then, yeah, I think we have plenty of time to go through some questions.
Hello again. Yeah, so I'm just going to give Andreas a couple of seconds to catch his breath. So we've got lots of questions that have come in, and they're all really, really good ones. So we're going to jump into those now in a second. What we'll do is, because those watching the video afterwards won't be able to see the typed questions, either myself or Andreas will say the questions out loud, and then we'll answer it and sort of go through it. And I just want to sort of answer something verbally as well, which people are asking is, can you send a recording of this video? Absolutely. Tomorrow or the next day, you'll receive an email with a recording of this video, and you'll also receive a link to the next webinar, which is the advanced webinar. And if you're curious what's going to be in the advanced webinar, it's got to be written on a piece of paper. We're going to be covering over smart values in much more detail because they're super powerful. They can do a lot of things. We'll talk about the difference between global and project rules. We're going to dig into branch rules, related conditions. We're going to go into a lot more of the advanced triggers and webhooks, things like that. And we're also going to talk about third-party extensions. So, you know, everything from Enfeed, Midori, the script runner integration, all that sort of stuff as well. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the first questions, and I'll go right back to the start when John asked, how is it best to organize rules? By type of action being performed, example, triage new issue, by type of customer, and so on. So essentially, how is it best to organize the rules?
Yeah, thanks, John. That's a really good question. So it kind of, to be honest, depends a lot on your usage and your usage of Jira. So whether you're using Jira more in a service desk kind of context, or if it's more for, I guess, Jira core or Jira software context. So we tend to organize rules a lot with the labels on the left here. So if you start getting a lot of rules in your list, and in fact, we ourselves have probably several hundred rules configured, we tend to group them a little bit by functionality. So we have like some labels on the left here for all of our support rules. And we also have some labels around auto assigning, for example. So that it's really up to you, and you can define as many labels as you want on the left here. The other thing I'll point out is that you can also search for rules simply by text. So you can filter rules up here. So it's actually very quick and easy to find rules if you have a lot of them. Yeah, that's probably the best way to organize them. Okay. All right, let's jump to the next question. Okay, so we've got another question here from John, asking about if the order of rules firing is non-deterministic. So what happens if 5 rules are triggered on issue created? Which one will be run first? Yeah, that's correct. So it's non-deterministic. One of the main reasons for this is that it's better for performance if we don't, have like a deterministic order in which the rules fire. So yeah, if you define 5 rules, then they will execute in random order. There are ways that you can potentially chain rules. So you can get one rule to fire off an event that will trigger another rule, but that's probably a slightly more advanced topic. But we do have in server, we do have a publish event action that can then trigger another rule that's listening for that event. All right. There's a question here from Tony about if we can create an issue or task from an inbound email. That's probably not something that is really for automation. So Jira already has inbound email handlers that will scan an email inbox and create issues. Automation rules really are more for running actions after the issue was created. So you can define a rule like we did earlier for when an issue is created. So that means Jira has already created the issue, and then you can do things like edit them, etc. All right, many questions from John. So there's a best practice question. So is it better to have many single purpose rules that will all fire on a given issue, or is it better to have one rule that does everything? That's an interesting one. It's a good question. To be honest, it doesn't matter too much. Personally, I think having a single rule that kind of does everything is a bit easier to manage than having, 10 different rules, 10 different very small rules defined. But it's really kind of depends on your use case and what you're trying to do. All right, let's jump into another question here from Robert. So there's a question about what is the difference between the two triggers, JQL query and compare values. I think that was meant to be between the two conditions, JQL query and compare values. All right, so for that, I'll actually can quickly jump back into automation and show you what we're talking about. So let's go and create a quick rule here. So we have, what we're talking about is the two different conditions here, JQL condition and compare condition. So the difference for these is, so the JQL condition is kind of the simple case that I showed you today, where you can just run a JQL query. The compare condition is probably a more advanced use case that allows you to compare, do more exact text comparisons, for example. So things with JQL that are difficult are to do an exact match on the summary of an issue. You can't really do that with JQL because JQL kind of does fuzzy searching and doesn't do exact text matching. But in, like, say, a compare condition, you could do something like look at the summary and make sure that it exactly equals hello in this example. And there's a few other cases that we can solve with this compare condition that are not possible with JQL. So it's a slightly more advanced condition that you probably won't need to get started. You know, like, it's something that our power users are definitely using. Okay, next question from Alexi. Is there a way to combine multiple triggers or must it be separate rules? So we do have a special trigger, which is the multiple issue event trigger. So in this, you can actually define a rule such that it listens for multiple events. So you can, for example, do things when an issue is created or an issue is updated, and run the rule in both cases. Another trigger that I will show you is the field value change trigger, where you can simply listen, say, for a change to the description field. And this will actually execute for all the different operations. So whether you're creating the issue, editing the issue, transitioning it, or assigning it, this rule would trigger basically on any change to this field. Wow, lots of questions. Getting through this one by one. So we have one from UC Yi here. So as far as I know, the automation rule is only suitable for new issues. Is there a way to run the rule among tickets with a certain date range? Yeah, so that's definitely possible. So today I only showed you triggers that trigger on issue events like issue created. But as I mentioned, we do have a scheduled trigger. So you could set this to run, say, every day. And then you could set this to run a query, for example, and look for issues that are, for example, of high priority, and, you know, status is in to do, for example. So this rule would now execute every day, search for issues with this, and then you could perform any number of conditions and actions on those issues that match this JQL. So you can certainly run rules for existing issues as well. Okay. There's a question from Robert around changing the log level on the audit log. So only show entries when a rule is triggered. Or in other words, only show audit log entries when actions were performed. So let's come back real quick to our audit log, just to explain what we mean or what Robert meant by that question. So if we come back to our rule here, so for some rules, there will be executions with no actions performed. And I think Robert would like to filter these out. So that's something that we don't support yet, but it's definitely been a highly requested feature. It's probably something that we'll work on in the near term. So hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll be able to ship an improvement around this so you can filter out rule executions where only the ones where actions were performed are shown. All right, there's a question here from Mikhail. I hope I'm not mispronouncing all these names terribly. Apologies if I am. So there's a question on, is it possible to select a specific transition instead of the start and target status in the issue transition trigger? So that's something that has come up a number of times. The unfortunate problem there is that the Jira API doesn't actually provide that information to us. So when an issue is transitioned, it doesn't actually tell us which specific transition was used. So at the moment, we can't, unfortunately, actually provide that functionality. So it's an issue we've actually raised with Atlassian 2.5 years ago, but we still haven't actually seen them implement that functionality for us on their end. Okay, another question from Alexi. Can automation act as the current user, not as the author of automation? So this is talking a little bit about a concept that I didn't talk about today, which we may cover next week in our advanced webinar. But basically, all automation rules are executed as a rule actor. So there's a specific user in Jira that will be used to execute rules. And this is something that's visible from the rule details screen of a rule. So in this example, you can see that the actor is John. So when an action is performed, it would be done as if John would be assigning or performing that action in Jira. We do not support changing the actor to the current user yet. It's something that's come up a number of times, but it's probably not on our short-term roadmap. There's a few challenges to implementing that. So it's probably going to be a little while before we get to that feature. There is a question from Christina around, is it possible to create a rule that will send a list of issues via email every day at a specific time? So that's also a very common use case. So yeah, that's something that you can do. So you can just use that schedule trigger that I had earlier, and then we have a send email action that will send emails for all the issues mentioned in the schedule trigger. I will point out though as well that Jira actually provides this as well out of the box. So you can actually save a search in Jira. So if you save a search in Jira as a filter, you can actually add a subscription to that filter, and that will also send out a summary email. So this is actually something that Jira already provides out of the box as well. All right, there's a question around permissions from Leszek, I believe. So the question is, who has by default permissions to create new rules for a particular project? Is it the project admin? Yeah, so with automation for Jira, all project admins can create rules within their own project, and global admins can also create global rules that work in multiple projects. And we'll talk about this distinction between global and project rules a lot more next week. But yeah, so project admins can only create rules that will perform changes within their own project. We do have the ability though, for global admins to restrict which project admins can create rules. So in our global admin section, there's a permissions configuration UI where global administrators could actually further restrict and say only certain project admins are allowed to do this, or perhaps no project administrators are allowed to do this. There's a question from Robert about, is it possible to reload the issue automatically after executing a rule? That's something we don't support at the moment. It's a little bit tricky because there could actually be some users editing that issue at the same time. So if we could just go ahead and reload that issue, we might actually be interrupting their flow of editing the issue. And unfortunately, Atlassian don't really provide any good APIs for us where we can check, is there an issue edit happening at the time? So we haven't gone ahead and implemented that at the moment. So yeah, it's probably not going to be implemented anytime soon because we're really lacking some APIs from the Atlassian side there. All right. There's a question from Mary. Am I able to create link tickets in a different project using triggers? So for example, if I create an issue in project A, I would like to create a linked issue in project B. Yeah, and that's definitely something that's possible. So you could simply create a rule. Perhaps let's actually walk through this because it's actually quite a common use case. So you could create a rule with an issue created trigger like this. And then you can simply use our create issue action to pick another project. I don't actually have any other projects configured in this instance here, but if there was another project here, then you could just pick it. You know, create the issue type, add a summary, And then you can actually link that issue straight back to the trigger issue. So when this issue is created, it would be linked back to the issue that was created originally. So it's a very simple and quick way that you can create linked issues in another project. There's a question from Serge about how we can add labels and how to add labels. So once again, you can do that with our edit issue action. So I'll just jump into that real quick. So we can add the labels field here. Now by default, you can set labels. So if I use the field like this would override all labels on the issue and just set them to these two. But we have the option for labels to add and remove values. So if you click on this ... menu on the right here, there's an option here to either copy labels from something or add and remove them. And then you can simply define labels that you want to specifically add to the existing set of labels. Whoops. Okay, sorry. The next question was, how do we add a label on the rule? So this was not about adding labels for issues. So this was about adding labels to the rule. But I'll show you another use case anyway. Okay, so for adding labels to a rule, that's pretty intuitive, hopefully, in our UI as well. We'll cover this a little bit more in our webinar next week. But we can simply create new labels on the left here. So say let's create a label for assigning rules. And we add this, so you'll see there's a new label here, and you can simply drag rules onto this label to add them to that label. So this rule over here is now in the assigning label, and if I filter by these, then only this rule now shows up. So this is like our quick way of organizing your rule list if you have lots of them, and you can define as many of these labels as you like. All right, we're getting to the end of the questions, I believe.
So chat.
Sorry. Okay, there's a few more, John tells me, and we do have time. So there's actually 3 more questions as well on the list. Yeah, okay, so there's a question from John around, are there any plans to allow searching the rule contents for text string? So filtering right now only searches the rule names. Yep, so what we're talking about is when you filter in here, we don't currently search through all the components of a rule for that specific text. Yep, that's probably something we will add in future. It's just a matter of priorities. We have a very long list of higher priority issues that we need to work on, and but it's definitely something in our backlog as well. I don't really know how soon we will get to that. Okay, let's see. It's a question for John probably. Is it possible to order or receive t-shirts for Jira automation?
I'll see a question I can answer. I can slide my chair back over. So I suppose there's 2 answers for that. If you're going to be in Las Vegas for Summit, you can pop along and I'll set one aside for you. But equally, if you want to just pop through a message to our support, I'm sure I can arrange something for you. So I get the easy questions.
There's one more question that I skipped over, actually, apologies, from Serge. It's about smart values. And it's a particular question about not being able to reach inside fields. Is that a known issue? So custom fields provided by other add-ons should actually be accessible, but it depends a little bit on the custom fields and on that other add-on. I believe inside fields should be accessible. So if you're having a specific problem, please contact us in support. So you can just go to our marketplace listing and go to the support tab there to find out how to contact us. And create a support request with your, maybe include like a screenshot of your rule, and we should be able to help you out to get that resolved. Right, I think
I'm going to jump back in. So we've been going through the Q&A, and I could just see in the chat that Jürgen, you have said your question's lost. It's not actually. So there's 2 ways to ask questions. There's one in the Q&A and there's one in the chat box. So we've covered over the Q&A, but we actually have lots more questions to do in the chat room. So I'm just going to go there now and we'll have a look at it. No worries.
Lots of questions today.
Yeah, this is good. I should have had a coffee beforehand.
Yeah.
All right, let's starting off with David. I'm going to read this one out just because I feel a bit left out. From David, how does automation coordinate with steps defined in workflows? Say the workflow sends emails on states, but what if an automation rule overlaps with that? Any best practices on how to make sure there are no conflicts?
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify, I think what David means is, say you have your Jira workflow set up with some post functions already to send notifications or send emails, and then you add an automation rule that also does something on that same issue transition. So there's no conflicts. So you can think of automation for Jira almost like a layer on top of your workflow. So what we do is we actually run immediately after your workflow transition happens. So when, say, a user transitions an issue through the workflow, say a user moves an issue to in progress, then that workflow will execute in Jira. All its post functions will execute. So that would send out emails and all the things you've defined in your workflow. And then finally, it sends an event to us telling us that there's an issue transition that happened. And at that stage, the automation rule would kick off and then run any actions that you've defined in your automation rule. And so that would run any additional stuff. Now, of course, if you define your automation rule to also send emails, then you would get your customer would get, or your user would get 2 emails potentially, but it's something that you just have to manage. So at some stage, you might have to decide if you want to edit your workflows every time and kind of add things like sending emails to your workflow post functions, or perhaps it's easier if you just manage that in automation. It kind of depends on your use case a lot. Okay, so there's a question from Ricky around, is the balanced workload assign option that I showed earlier ideal for something like a Jira Service Desk environment? Yep, we think so. So we actually use this ourselves internally for our service desk. So whenever our customers, you yourselves, raise support requests with us, we have an automation rule that will actually assign those support requests with a balanced workload to any member of our team. Now, some people might argue this doesn't take into account complexity of the support issue. And that's true. We don't factor that in right now with our balancing algorithm. But actually, in practice, it turns out by purely randomly balancing out support issues, so making sure that each user has the same number of issues assigned, the complexity balances out randomly anyway. So some weeks you might have some more complex issues, but in other weeks you'll get easier issues. And what I've found from my past experience working in support at Atlassian, it's very hard to actually measure complexity of support issues accurately up front, because often as a support issue evolves over time, new questions come up that then make a really simple case very complicated all of a sudden anyway. There's a question from Danielle around group assigning, like picking a random member of a group. Is that possible? So we don't support selecting a group yet in that assign action. At the moment, you have to expand it out to a list of people. It's probably definitely something that we'll look at improving sort of in the long term. There's a question from Christoph. Do we have any plans to make a tighter integration with Tempo plugins? So that's probably something we'll mention in our webinar next week, potentially. But so at the moment, we have no plans. But the thing is, automation for Jira is actually extendable. And we have a bunch of third-party vendors, for example, Midori and nFeeds from Valiantes, that have added extensions and that have added custom actions that appear in our UI if both, say, the nFeeds add-on is installed alongside automation for Jira. So that's something, if a lot of users would be interested in Tempo automation actions, it'd be good if you can talk to Tempo, and we can certainly have a chat with them as well about potentially getting them to build an integration and a custom action for Tempo. One thing I will mention is we are currently also adding support for the Tempo account field so that you can edit that more easily with our edit issue action. There's a question from David about how do we define capture the country. So this, I'm guessing, is related to the example rule that I showed earlier. So this was obviously a bit of a contrived example. I was simply added a custom field called country to my issues. You could obviously get users to fill that in. There's potentially other ways you could do that as well. Depends a lot on your setup and particular use case. You could either do that through automation rules by looking at potentially the domain of the email of the reporter and set it automatically. Or maybe you have some other system that's actually creating the issues in Jira. It's a bit of a difficult one to answer without like a specific use case, I guess. Okay, there's a question from Brandon about the if-else topic to match country. Can we pass through a table with 20 key value pairs rather than having like a big and long if-else? So say if you had 20 countries. Yeah, so that's one that's on our roadmap. It definitely comes up quite a bit. So it's probably not on our near-term roadmap, but hopefully at some stage in the next year or so, we'll be able to get to that feature request. So the idea is at the beginning of your rule, you could define some kind of map or a table where you could define for these countries, assign the issue to these users, and then you can use that later on in your rule. But yeah, it's just a matter of finding the time to build it. There's a question from David around, is there a trigger that can inform you about changes in versions, like when a version's created, released, or archived? Yep, that's something that we support. So if I just jump real quick, so we have a bunch of version triggers around version created, released, version updated, and so on, that then allow you to do things with that rule. Okay. There's a question from Jürgen around, do we have the ability to use something like email templates for sending emails? Not at the moment. At the moment, our send email action and other notification like Teams notifications, etc., require you to enter the body every time. It's probably on our longer term roadmap to build something like that. There's a question from Michael. Can a rule edit issue fields on issues that were just created? And then also close the issue if the summary contains keywords. Otherwise, just edit the fields. Yep, that's definitely something that's possible. So you could create a rule that's triggered on issue created. And then you could use an if-else condition that I showed you earlier. That would simply, for example, check that the summary contains some keywords with the condition. And if it does, then it transitions the issue to close. And otherwise, you could include an else block and just include an edit issue action to edit some fields. Jonathan wants, everyone wants t-shirts now. Well, if you want t-shirts, come by our booth at Summit and we'll hand them out for sure. All right. Is there any, I think that's kind of it for the questions. Or is there one more?
One more from Felicia.
Yeah. Okay, there's one from Felicia around, are there any tips for writing triggers or conditions which can determine when a component is changed from a specific value? So jaql queries do not allow for, yeah, okay, so this is like, so when a field is changed from a specific value, I believe, or I guess the component field in Jira. Yeah, so for that, you can use our field value change trigger. So in this, you could simply select the components field here, and you can actually access the old and new value with some smart values that you could then use in a compare condition. And that's something that we might look at next week when we cover smart values as well. But basically, when you use this trigger, later on, you could use this special field change from string smart value to retrieve the old value of the components field before it was changed. All right. Oh, I think that's pretty much it. I think we've covered. Oh, there's one last one from Mikhail. Does the compare condition work with number fields? Something like A is greater than B. It does. It's not quite as simple as we'd like it to be yet. So we're actually working on a new issue condition that will make this a lot easier. For now, you will have to use some of our math functions to compare number fields. So if I jump back to our documentation, one thing I didn't mention is if you're interested in more details about smart values before our more advanced webinar next week, there's actually 2 sections up here that introduce smart values and also show you what available values we have. For your particular question around comparing number fields, you can use our maths functions, and there's a specific section here around Boolean operators. So you can use a greater than, less than function, and then you can use the result in a compare condition. Yeah, so if you're having trouble with that, feel free to raise a support request. We can help you out in getting that going as well. But as I mentioned, we are working on making this a bit easier as well, because it's a pretty common use case. All right, I think we're probably right out of time and also out of questions.
Yeah.
So I guess thanks very much for everyone who's participated, asked questions. There's some great questions here, and we hope we've done a decent enough job answering those. I think John has a few more housekeeping items as well.
That's pretty much it, to be honest. So I just wanted to say thanks from both of us for attending. I know it's late and early and whatnot for lots of people, so we really appreciate you using automation for Jira. If you have any questions that you forgot to ask, feel free to send them through. Otherwise, we hope to see you next week in exactly 8 days for a more advanced webinar. And like I say, we'll send out a recording of this and a link to that webinar probably tomorrow. Yeah, other than that, goodbye.
Yep, thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers.